on the beach, seashells, seaweed, empty plastic bottles, driftwood, the corpse of a Welsh tramp dressed up to look like an officer of the Royal Marines. Okay, so maybe that last one was a bit of a curveball, but that's exactly what a Spanish fisherman found near the port city of Huelva in 1943 during the Second World War. Of course, it isn't unheard of for dead soldiers to wash up on beaches in times of war, but this was no ordinary corpse. And, in discovering it, the unwitting fisherman triggered the first step in a carefully orchestrated chain of events devised by the British Secret Service to fool Adolf Hitler into making a catastrophic tactical blunder. You see, by this point in the war, the tide was already beginning to turn in favour of the Allies. The Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor in 1941 had convinced the United States to make a timely appearance on the global battlefield. The Nazi invasion of the Soviet Union was fast turning into an unmitigated disaster, and the Allies had just scored a resounding victory in the North African campaign. But for all this success, by early 1943, the Nazis and their Axis allies still controlled most of Europe, something that was going to need to be rectified if the war was to be won. Luckily, with the North African campaign concluded, the Allies suddenly had huge numbers of troops in need of a new assignment. The only question was, what were they going to do with them? Victory in Africa had opened up a whole new angle of attack against the Axis powers, and the Allies planned to use it. There were two possible targets: Sicily, which would give the Allies a foothold in Italy and clear important shipping lanes in the Mediterranean, or Greece, allowing for a pincer movement, pressing the Germans up against the Soviets on the Eastern Front. Both options had their merits, but as far as the Allies were concerned, only one really made sense: invading Sicily. Unfortunately, Sicily was such a juicy target, hanging there like a big, ripe, strategically important plum at the end of Italy's big toe. The Axis powers were bound to anticipate the attack and concentrate their defences accordingly. Which brings me back to our recently deceased Welsh tramp, who also happens to be the key to Operation Mincemeat, a stroke of tactical deception so ridiculous and bizarre, the fact it actually worked surprised everyone, not least the people who devised it. The aim of Operation Mincemeat was simple: convince Hitler, as well as fellow fascism enthusiast Benito Mussolini and all the rest of the Axis powers, that Greece, rather than Sicily, was the ultimate destination for the Allies' troops in North Africa. But how exactly do you go about fooling the sharpest minds in the Nazi party into thinking you're going to do one thing when really you're going to do the complete opposite? Easy. You find a nice fresh corpse, dress it up to look like a British Royal Marine, shove a briefcase full of fake top-secret documents into its cold, dead hands, then drop the corpse into the ocean, wait for it to get washed up and discovered by German intelligence, and finally hope they believe the fictional invasion plans you've planted inside the briefcase are authentic. Okay, so maybe it's not that easy. If all of this is starting to sound like something straight out of a James Bond movie, then hey, that's very perceptive of you. Operation Mincemeat was based in part on a short document of creative military deception techniques called the Trout Memo, which was circulated by a man named Admiral John Godfrey. But whilst Godfrey took all the credit for the ideas in the Trout Memo, most historians seem to agree the document was probably written by his assistant, Ian Fleming, who, after the war, would go on to write the first Bond novel. Whilst the Trout Memo contained the central idea behind Operation Mincemeat, it didn't account for all the finer points of the plan, like where to get the body, how to create a plausible identity for a man who never existed, or how to transport a corpse all the way to Spain without being murdered by Germans. Intelligence officers Charles Chumley, yes, weirdly that is how you pronounce that, and Ewan Montagu were tasked with overcoming those little challenges. And the first thing on their checklist was to obtain a corpse for the job at hand. Not only did the corpse have to be the right age and gender, but the deceased also had to have died recently so as to be in a believable state of decomposition when discovered. Whilst plenty of young men died on a regular basis during the war, it turns out most families in mourning want their loved ones laid to rest respectfully, as opposed to dressed up in uniform and tossed into the ocean upon their tragic demise, which meant Chumley and Montagu would ideally need to find a body with no known relatives. Under normal circumstances, it might have been almost impossible to find a suitable stiff in such short notice, but this was wartime, and unlike sugar, coal, and nylon, dead bodies were one of the few commodities not in short supply. So, Chumley and Montagu made a few discreet inquiries, and before long, word of an appropriate body reached their ears. Before becoming a full-time corpse, that body had belonged to Glyndwr Michael, a Welsh vagrant who'd tragically taken his own life by ingesting rat poison in an abandoned warehouse in King's Cross. Glyndwr's body fit the bill perfectly, and with no family to notify of his death, it was soon at the disposal of the British Secret Service. Of course, obtaining a corpse was only the first step in the mincemeat plan. Before it could be dropped into Spanish waters, it needed a new identity. So, Chumley and Montagu set about transforming Welsh vagrant Glyndwr Michael into the fictitious Major William Martin, distinguished member of the Royal Marines. Nothing could be left to chance when attempting to deceive high-ranking Nazi officials, so their attention to detail needed to be meticulous. Even Major William Martin's name and rank were carefully chosen. He was designated the official rank of acting major, as this made him senior enough to be entrusted with top-secret documents, but not prominent enough that his name or face would be known to the Germans. The surname Martin was chosen simply because it was the most common name amongst officers of the same rank. As for him being a Royal Marine, that was more a case of convenience. Their uniforms were the easiest to obtain. Or at least that's what Chumley and Montagu thought, until they encountered an unexpected uniform-related problem. As a high-ranking member of the Royal Marines, Major William Martin would be expected to be sporting a lovely pair of woolen underpants. Any other kind would raise suspicions. The Nazis may have counted some of the most evil men in history amongst their number, but apparently they really knew their underpants. Unfortunately, such luxuries as woolen drawers were in very limited supply at the time, and no one was willing to part with theirs. But this little issue was eventually solved by another recently deceased person. A college warden by the name of Herbert Fisher, whose grieving family kindly donated a pair of his old undies to the war effort. Not only did Major William Martin need to be dressed appropriately, he also needed to have a convincing backstory. These days, someone could have whipped up a Facebook page complete with embarrassing drunken photos of the Major's university days in no time at all. But back then, they had to be a bit more creative. Chumley and Montagu started to curate a collection of what they like to refer to as pocket litter, personal items and trinkets that would make Major Martin feel real. Things like cigarettes, postage stamps, matches, keys, receipts, and ticket stubs. The Major was even given a fictitious fiancée called Pam, who existed in the form of 2 love letters, a receipt for a diamond engagement ring, and a rather saucy photograph, well, for the time, of Pam drying herself off with a beach towel. In reality, Pam was Jean, and Jean worked just down the corridor at MI5. Of all the fake documentation needed to bring Major Martin to life, the most important and problematic was his naval ID card. The problem was, there were no photos of Glyndwr Michael from his pre-rat poison days. Attempts were made to photograph the cadaver, but Michael made a terrible model. He was far too stiff. Montagu pondered over this little poser for days before realizing the solution to his problem was staring him right in the face. Literally. During a meeting at MI5, he found himself sitting across from a man named Ronnie Reed, who, in Montagu's own words, could have been the twin brother of Glyndor Michael. So Reed's headshot was taken and the ID card was completed. For added authenticity, Montagu then spent the next few weeks rubbing the card against his trouser leg in order to give it an authentic, worn-in look, which was all the rage for ID cards at the time. Chumley and Montagu finally had everything they needed to set Operation Mincemeat into action. But as the body was dressed and readied for transportation, the pair hit another snag, this time in the form of Major Martin's military boots. To keep the body preserved, it had been kept on ice for several months. But, as I'm sure you're aware, attempting to jam a pair of standard issue military boots onto the feet of a frozen corpse is no mean feat. And try as they might, Chumley and Montagu couldn't manage it. Luckily, this little hurdle was overcome relatively easily. The pair grabbed the nearest electrical heater, plugged it in, aimed it at the corpse's feet, and forged them out until they were just soft enough to slide the boots right into place. And you thought being a spy was glamorous. With his ID card suitably worn, a saucy photograph of his fiancée in his pocket, and his military boots laced up, Glyndor Michael was now officially Major William Martin of the Royal Marines, leaving the Secret Service to turn their attention to the next stage of the plan, delivering the body into the hands of the Nazis. Spain was chosen for the job, as it was known to be rife with German spy activity at the time, and the British knew a washed-up Royal Marine would soon have the Nazis buzzing around it like flies around, well, a dead body. But simply dropping the corpse out of a plane and into the ocean was far too risky. People tend to notice things like aeroplanes during world wars, and boats are also pretty conspicuous. This job called for something a little more covert. A submarine called the HMS Seraph. The Seraph took 10 days to complete its journey to the Spanish coastline. After a day of reconnaissance, the submarine surfaced, and the body, which had been preserved inside a specially built container, was brought up to the deck and released into the ocean. It was discovered only a few hours later. News soon reached the Nazis, who were practically salivating at the prospect of having a sneaky peek inside Major William Martin's top-secret briefcase. Official procedures dictated that the Spanish authorities should have sent the briefcase straight back to the British, and they did. But, as had been predicted, first they allowed German spies to have a gander at the goodies inside. We know this because when the Secret Service inspected the documents after their return to Britain, a single eyelash, which had been carefully placed within the folds of one of the letters, was noticeably absent. The fictitious plans had been read by the enemy. Photographs of the falsified document ran up the Nazi commands chain faster than you could do one of those salutes that would get you arrested today. And soon enough they found their way into the hands of the Führer himself. He didn't doubt the authenticity of the plans for one moment. In fact, when Benito Mussolini tried to convince him that it seemed very likely the Allies would focus their attentions on Sicily, not Greece, Hitler simply refused to listen. And he was adamant the spies had struck gold by intercepting genuine British military plans. This blind belief in the authenticity of the documents might sound a little naive. After all, it must have occurred to someone that the documents could have been faked. But the deception went beyond just a body and a briefcase. The whole ruse was supported by a large number of pre-scripted diplomatic cables exchanged between Britain and Spain, in which the British made it clear how important it was that the briefcase be recovered and kept out of the hands of the Nazis. The real genius here was that these messages were all heavily encrypted, but the British knew the Germans had cracked their cipher. When the briefcase finally made it back to Blighty, a further series of messages was sent to report the tests had been carried out on the contents of the case, confirming they hadn't been compromised. This was a vital step, as naturally the Allies would have changed their plans if they had reason to believe the Germans had gotten wind of them. The complex deception was outrageously successful. Convinced he had gotten one over on the Allies, Hitler gave orders for an entire panzer division of some 90,000 soldiers to be deployed to a place Britain had absolutely no intention of invading, leaving the Allies free to invade Sicily with relative ease. By the time Hitler realized his mistake, it was too late. The successful invasion of Sicily held huge consequences for Hitler and his attempts at world domination. It paved the way for the Allied invasion of Italy and hastened Mussolini's fall from power. And in his desperation to regain control of the Mediterranean, Hitler called off a huge planned offensive against the Soviet Union, diverting 1/5 of the entire German army from the east to southern Europe, giving the Soviets a decisive advantage in the battle for the Eastern Front. If the tides of war had been starting to turn when Operation Mincemeat was first conceived, by the time the grand deception had actually panned out, it isn't much of a stretch to suggest the Allies were actually winning. Today, Operation Mincemeat is regarded as one of the most successful feats of deception ever pulled off in the theatre of war, the modern-day equivalent of the Trojan horse. Had the mission failed, it's possible the outcome of the war would have been very different and a lot more swastikery. But what of the real hero of the story? Glyndwr Michael, the Welsh vagrant who died twice to deceive the Nazis. A man who'd felt his own life so insignificant, he decided to end it alone in a warehouse in London. His body was buried in Spain with full military honours. For many years, his tombstone only bore the name of his fictional alter ego, the man who never was, Major William Martin. But in 1997, his real name was finally added to his resting place. The great tragedy, of course, is that Glyndwr Michael will never know how he fooled Hitler and changed the course of history in the process. Thank you for watching. You can get your hands on my book, Stick a Flag in It, over on Amazon or on Audible. Links to both in the description below. Thank you.